Hang on. Can you folks hear me now? I'm seeing audio go in. Okay. Hi, can folks hear me now? Okay. Mm-hmm. All right, sorry about that, folks. Should I just continue from where I'm at right now? Okay. So sorry about that, folks. So I just went over a little bit of the history of the 50-year rule, its purpose, where it came from. And I guess I'll continue by just giving you some view from the Trust Modern program sort of research and across the country in the past few years about what the effect of the 50-year rule has been on the preservation landscape to date. And I should start by saying that while the National Register program very clearly states that the 50-year guideline is not meant to exclude or prohibit resources from being considered for listing, in practice, the percentage of resources on the National Register with periods of significance and not necessarily built dates that end in the previous 50 years has always been plus or minus about 3% of all listings since the 1970s. So fairly guarded results in terms of the operation of the 50-year criterion. This statistic, of course, doesn't include resources built less than 50 years ago, which is probably even lower. Our collective focus on the 50-year mark in terms of, I think, the perception of what's historic and where we focus our scholarly and professional efforts also means that sometimes our historic registers, including the National Register, give quite an uneven reflection of the history of our cultural and built environment. Of course, really, which is one of the key, I think, issues in terms of why the rule is somewhat controversial for some preservationists. Getting a slide change. Sorry, I'm trying to change the slide. It's not working.
Be the arrow, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure it's clicked on.
Yeah. I'm not...
So weird. And then try it. I click on
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, there we go. Pardon me. As historic preservation practices matured over the past, 40-plus years, this one criterion and this number 50 have also grown to exert tremendous influence on the workings of American preservation beyond a direct role in qualifying properties for inclusion in the National Register. The 50-year threshold, along with other criterion for listing on the National Register, are modeled in more than 1,000 state and local preservation programs around the country, some of which have an exceptional significance consideration or exception, but many that do not. The criterion has evolved to guide a pretty wide array of preservation activities, such as the scope of historic resource surveys, the level of consideration afforded in environmental and design review processes, whether properties are subject to things like demolition delay review, access to incentives, via designation, also other incentives like historic building codes, tax credit programs, facade improvement programs, and grant funding. There's really no research available or even easily compiled on the number of designated properties less than 50 years old at the state and local levels, but given the percentage on the National Register, it's likely that it's similar at the local level, if not less. So some examples of the rather odd effects of the 50-year criterion on registers of historic places and local preservation programs. For example, John Lautner, a fairly well-known modern architect, well-recognized modern architect, often called the father of Googie, among other things. There's only one building designed by John Lautner on the National Register of Historic Places that we know of, which is the Stevens House here in Malibu, California, which was listed in 2009. Go California. But again, kind of odd that such a well-known architect would have such limited recognition on what's supposed to be a register of things worthy of preservation across the country. On the cultural side of things, there are no resources recognized on the National Register for their association with the hippie movement of the late 1960s, which I think some of us as practitioners can probably understand some of the reasons behind that in terms of getting up to speed on the context, but to the general public seems completely bizarre when you let them know that. And in Palm Springs, for example, in California, with its amazing collection of modern residences from the span of the 20th century, has no buildings listed on the National Register at all, actually from the modern era, mostly relying on its local ordinance and protections to preserve those places. And in looking at the local level in our own beloved San Francisco, an interesting case in and of itself. It has 173 listings on the National Register here in the city and county of San Francisco, but there's only one from after World War II, which represents 1/2% of its National Register listings. And even more telling, perhaps, about the power of the 50-year rule in the preservation ethos, so to speak, is that local designations of post-war resources in San Francisco are even lower. And this is despite the fact that there actually is no age threshold for local designation here in San Francisco. There's no 50-year rule, no 25-year rule, no nothing. So out of 265 local landmarks, there's only 3 that date from after World War II, and only 2 of these were listed when they were less than 50 years old, or markedly less than 50 years old. And the 2 resources are rather interesting. It's the Soul building designed by Frank Lloyd Wright here in the city, the Morris building, and a local pop icon, our beloved Doggy Diner sign from the 1960s, which is no longer attached to a Doggy Diner restaurant, but it survives as its own thing. So why should, I guess the question, of course, too, is, why should we care about, the preservation of resources that fall through the 50-year crack? Why is it important to pay more attention to these resources if they go relatively unrecognized and unprotected? Well, first and foremost, it's a numbers game, which is kind of an interesting argument, but we need to get a jump on basically what would be an overwhelming landscape of potentially eligible resources before they get the jump on us. And I don't think we're unfortunately making a lot of progress except in nationwide on this issue. These building statistics are compiled by Chris French from census data and show us that while approximately 3% of existing buildings date from before 1900, so 3% of existing buildings are from before 1900. Approximately 80% date from after World War II, and more than 50% of those buildings are less than 50 years old. So it's a massive number of buildings to evaluate, and certainly looking at probably a fair amount of significant loss if more attention isn't given to these resources. The 50-year waiting period for evaluating historic resources and its companion exceptional significance criterion is also a cause for concern for a lot of preservationists because of the remarkable rate at which younger resources are simply being lost with little or no consideration of their significance. It's becoming an increasing rarity that contemporary historians can enjoy a 50-year window to evaluate the significance of a place. And forces like densification of suburban and urban environments, especially real estate markets where the land is worth more than existing buildings. Here in California, that can often be the case. And the continual cycle of rehabilitation for commercial and retail structures really threatens scores of recent past buildings and landscapes. And these are just a few of the buildings from the recent past that have been lost in the more immediate past, certainly not solely because they were less than 50 years old, but the vulnerability of these resources and the perception that recent history is not worth saving is a constant threat as well. Many of you folks out there who appreciate modern architecture you can see that some of these resources are of varying contextual or individual significance, but all with unsuccessful preservation battles from the last 10 or 15 years. And these are, again, some buildings that we may soon lose, though preservationists are working really hard to save them. And the recent past, as you can see, remains really terribly vulnerable, even for buildings with recognized architects in areas that are with strong preservation programs. So I think the issue here is that, if we're saying things after 50 years old, or if we're creating a perception that things that are less than 50 years old are also less historic, we're going to have some pretty serious battles on our hands to preserve even iconic resources in the future. We should also care because, as we all know, recognition is really important. Without access to incentives and protections that come with eligibility or actual listing on historic registers, that public endorsement of significance is just not there, and resources and their advocates often can't find solutions for really important buildings. This has also come up more and more as we bump up against the 50-year age, and bumping up against the 50-year age rule as we seek to help people who protect places that really matter to them but may not matter as much to scholars and critics all the time. From Phillips Oil 76 ball signs, which there was a marked campaign to save several years ago in Southern California, to places like the Whiskey A Go-Go in Los Angeles, which actually won a recent LA Conservancy contest as the best loved place in Los Angeles from the 1960s. So there's a lot of traditional and non-traditional preservationists who are working to save places that they identify with personally and generationally, And it's just a mathematical fact that most of these places will be less than 50 years old and almost certainly won't qualify as exceptionally significant. You know, that's can be a hard argument to make for some of these. And with the 50-year guideline in place across much of the nation, preservationists have few options or tools to protect these underage resources. So breaking the 50-year barrier, how can we go about more proactively identifying and preserving recent past resources for preservation? Well, certainly there's a lot of challenges. The first and foremost being lack of adequate survey. This is just a period where we haven't focused a lot of attention because the 50-year or 40-year rule often tailors the scope of historic resource surveys. There are a lot of historic contexts that are underdeveloped, at least in accepted formats. A lot of this information that we can use to talk about these buildings, evaluate the buildings is out there, but hasn't necessarily been compiled in a format that's appropriate for the processes that we use. There's a lot of differing interpretations and a lack of understanding in some cases of exceptionally significant among practitioners and the public, and that's nationwide. We've seen a lot of different bars for what's considered exceptionally significant, a lot of different advice given. There's certainly a greater comfort level with designating exceptionally significant architecture rather versus historic or cultural resources, perhaps because architecture is a greater framework for critiquing and review and commentary than historic and cultural monuments. And also there's a lot of, frankly, stylistic and resource-specific prejudices, I think generationally as well as around different parts of the country as well. So we're also frequently, the other thing that makes it really difficult is we're frequently evaluating resources under threat with very limited time, and that makes thoughtful evaluation and scholarship pretty difficult. But there are communities across the nation who are taking up this work and nominating significant numbers of younger resources to the National Register quite successfully. And we'd like to share a few tips that we've gleaned and shared from experiences and observations on doing this work across the country. And I hope Chris will chime in on some of these as well. Okay, so tip number one. I think everyone who does this work can agree that context in the terms of the recent past is king. Historic context is really the core and framework for decision-making for historic designation, and most communities who successfully nominated underage resources to the National Register or designated them locally have a comprehensive historic context statement for this period of their development. So the kind of rule of thumb is that if the scholarship is sound, the story told, the decision-making, and the story is told, and the decision-making is sound, it's an easy case to make. And as we know, that of paramount consideration in terms of the National Register and similar programs that are looking to, again, guard against, designating resources where the recognition may not stand the test of time. One example I'd like to share with you is from Fresno, California, which has a comprehensive context statement for modern architecture and design in their city. This is a picture, a historic image actually, of the Fulton Mall in Fresno, which was designed and constructed by 1964, conceptualized by Victor Gruen, and designed by landscape architect Garrett Ekbo. So this was actually nominated for the National Register and was given an official determination of eligibility by the keeper of the register last August as being exceptionally significant. And this was actually nominated by citizens with limited experience in writing about architecture and the National Register process, of course guided by our Office of Historic Preservation in the process as well. But basically we're able to use that context and other scholarship to successfully demonstrate the exceptional significance at the local and national levels. So the Fulton Mall was, interestingly enough, the first downtown pedestrian mall that was built with urban renewal funds, has an amazing degree of integrity, although sadly not well cared for at the moment, and also set a new standard for urban renewal planning across the country. So they were able to really demonstrate that significance given the fact that the community had a context for it, and they were able to draw on other scholarship to buttress that. So although the future of the Fulton Mall is very controversial and it remains very threatened, the decision made regarding its importance is defendable and reasonable, and has done a lot to, I think, elevate some discussion of what's going to happen with the mall as Fresno looks to revitalize its downtown.
Right, I would just mention that Victor Gruen is a major shopping mall architect who has significance. He developed the first indoor shopping center in Minnesota.
So our second tip is to tie resources to a continuum of history that predates the 50-year mark. So despite the dramatic changes in architecture and planning and social history in the last half of the 20th century, the last 50 years, the built environment, of course, did not just drop out of the sky from an alien planet. Everything has an antecedent. Everything has an influence from the past. Everything has a material tradition that it draws from. It may be completely reinterpreted, but that doesn't mean that it isn't part of that continuum of history in a community or in an architectural tradition or in a historic or social context. So tying later resources to this continuum supports the assertion of significance in important ways. And I've included here a quote from a National Register nomination for the Peg Fair Estates Historic District in Pasadena that I think demonstrates this practice very well. The incorporation of Asiatic features within or upon buildings within nature places the district in the California lineage of Frank Lloyd Wright, Green and Green, Richard Neutra, and Harwell Hamilton Harris, which I thought was an excellent example of how a successful nomination linked the architectural significance of, basically a very special group of ranch houses, or contemporary ranch houses in Pasadena, to a long architectural tradition and regional architectural tradition as well. Tip number 3 is that comparative evaluation is essential in proving not just general significance for something that is greater than 50 years old, but also paramount in proving exceptional significance. And again, with a good context and a well-drawn comparative evaluation, a strong argument can be made for exceptionalism. And I won't emphasize this again later, but to remember that there are many ways to be exceptional, and it's important to consider the resource's place in time, its degree of integrity, its community importance and or impact and influence, and a variety of ways in which the building is exceptional. And by offering comparisons, it's just another way to strengthen that argument, and is really essential to do well. Tip number 4, go local. The vast majority of resources listed on the National Register are locally significant, and demonstrating exceptional significance at the local level is fairly achievable in most cases, if you really have some good facts and context to work with. You remember, you and your consultants, your local preservationists and historians are the experts on your local history, and you shouldn't forget to tap into what we often call the sort of soft knowledge base of these advocates and enthusiasts to support your case, of course with substantiation. But there's a huge bank in many communities of volunteer efforts that are studying things from the recent past, often not architecture, but a lot of times that knowledge of roadside culture, different groups in your community that look at different aspects of history are an important resource to tap into when putting this information together to prove exceptional significance. So look at more recent past resources. Tip number 5 is to go beyond the usual sources. We often hear that underage resources don't meet the National Register bar, or it's thought that they can't meet the National Register bar because there isn't a sufficient context generated in which to evaluate their significance. And sometimes that is the case at the local level, but it's often a bit frustrating because it does reflect, I think, what you see as a kind of a gap that can occur between the preservation community and the scholarly community at times that should not be there for people who have such common interests in terms of architectural history and history. Architectural and historical research, scholarly research, is often a decade or more ahead of preservation-related context generation. So it's very important, again, to both tap into your local knowledge on the one hand, but also to engage more with scholarly research on the mid to late 20th century. Much of the information that's quote-unquote missing is just waiting to be put in the proper context format for registration programs. So it's something that we definitely need to do more of. Tip number 6 is actually to don't reinvent the context wheel. As the years have gone by, we've seen a survey of recent past resources increase around the country, and there are more and more context statements that are generated on topics from suburbanization to late 20th century roadside architecture. We have a modest library of context on our website. I know OHP maintains a listing of context statements from around California as well for various purposes and various themes and various time periods. So definitely use these resources as a starting point for your own local context. There's no reason certainly to duplicate work unnecessarily, because we all have enough to do, right? Tip number 7 is that exceptionalism is a many-splendored thing, as I say. I can't emphasize this enough, because in review of National Register nominations from various parts of the country, it's pretty impressive the range of takes on exceptionally significant. They're not always the first, best, only sort of school of exceptionalism, and take into consideration very local shades of what's considered exceptional, including design, community impact, integrity, and even rate of survival. So if you can identify, define, and support with evidence why your resource that's under less than 50 years old is exceptional, that there's a fair argument to be made, certainly, outside of first, best, only. One great example of that in California is the Laguna de San Gabriel playground in San Gabriel, California, which was listed on the California Register in 2009. And I've excerpted just a few items here from the discussion of its significance, just to show the variety of ways in which it was looked at as successful. So it was highly unique and masterfully rendered, hand-sculptured concrete play structures executed by hand that elevates the playground to the status of interactive arts, and again, a rare and threatened resource. So a combination of considerations about the artistry, the rarity and the threatened status of the resource, and the fact that it was not just, although there are many concrete playgrounds in Southern California and around the country, one that was exceptional in its level of artistic investment. And number 8, this is one of Chris's that I borrowed, is tell a story, save a building. And this is something that I've actually heard from others as well, or basically to gain a building, not just save a building, but gain a building recognition. Often we resort, I think, to very bureaucratic and architectural jargon when discussing resources, particularly in nominations. But to tell the story of a building, its history, its impact, how people in the community reached out or used the building, what makes it special, are often the most effective in conveying to professional practitioners and to the all-important public, certainly, why something is important. And a supreme example of this is Barbara Capitman, founder of the Miami Design Preservation League in Florida, who basically rewrote and reframed the way the American public today views Art Deco, both in Miami and around the nation. She was behind the listing of the first 20th century historic district on the National Register, which was the Miami Beach Architectural District in 1976, at a time when most people that equated Art Deco with how some people, I think, equate late modernism today. So again, just to recap our 8 tips for breaking the 50-year barrier, sure to be refined in the years to come. Basically, the focus has got to be on context, tying the resources to a continuum of history, comparing and contrasting to make the resource stand out, emphasizing the local significance and impact, going beyond the usual sources for information, drawing from established context, remembering that exceptionalism is varied, and telling a story to save a building. And I'd also like to finish by recognizing that the National Register and even the California Register are certainly not the end-all, be-all of preservation recognition. As we know, the most significant protections for historic buildings are at the local level, and in many cases, that may be where it can be best to focus your attention on the recent past. In California and across the nation, many communities operate with relaxed or no age thresholds for historic designation. And certainly there are pros and cons to this environment, some of which I explored in the forum article if you're interested in more on this topic. For example, for one, it's certainly easier at the local level to change preservation policy with regard to designation than at the state or federal level, and local designation affords much greater protection to resources than the generally honorary recognition of national or state register listings, although here in California, certainly with CEQA, that's a bit different. On the downside, sometimes communities are simply not ready to, in essence, curate the recent past or make a commitment to preserving those resources. And certainly we've seen cases where communities with no age limit have faced substantive public controversy about some of the decisions that they've made, because familiarity certainly breeds contempt, especially when it's your own backyard sometimes. If controversial issues arise, as they often do, local governments can also be called out for not conforming to nationally recognized standards, which is also something we've seen from time to time. And yet, as you can see by this brief list on the right, many of the major cities and communities in our country do manage to operate quite successfully without an age threshold, and it's something worth, I think, more investigation and more research and reflection in terms of how we navigate into this sort of uncharted landscape of the last 50 years in terms of preservation practice. So that's the end of our just sort of overview about the facets of the 50-year rule and some of the tips for for preserving resources that do require, at least for National Register listing and exceptional significance criteria consideration. And I guess we'd like to open it to questions and discussions. I hope everything's working okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And actually, one of the questions that we do have is how do you balance the preservation of modern architecture, which is abundant, with economic development? It seems that this dilemma may make local jurisdictions reluctant to pursue preservation of newer resources.
I think this is an issue that I think that the architectural community is actually starting to address sort of on the leading edge of I guess, development and preservation thought and architectural thought, in terms of rather than preserving in the way that we understand it today, in a rather curatorial or connoisseurship-based approach, especially when you have vast quantities of similar resources or just, large areas that can do qualify for some historic preservation consideration. We've seen a lot of publications recently and discussion recently actually about sort of retrofitting rather than preserving some of these environments, saving the best of the old and introducing more of the new, targeted densification, in terms of, we've seen a lot of redensification projects probably in urban areas all over the country and certainly here in California as people are more attuned to sustainability issues and transit and housing. So I think this is a situation where, we're getting some of the thought leadership from the architectural community, and we need to do some thought leadership ourselves in terms of how much change we can accept in some of these environments and still consider it to be a preservation, to have a preservation aspect. And that's something that I don't think we've thought about in depth, but we are seeing more and more of. And here in San Francisco, there's a major project, for example, to redensify Park Merced and create a more transit-friendly and environmentally friendly or sustainable housing development there, and commercial, small neighborhood basically they're creating on a massive site here. And redensification was not considered, and there wasn't really a lot of discussion of it. And certainly a lot of the redensification schemes that were proposed for that site as part of the environmental review process would not have allowed the property to retain its eligibility. So it is a sticky problem. But I think the other issue is that that just makes survey and survey and evaluation ahead of the game more important, so that you can actually have a framework for decision making when economic development and modern resources are pitted against each other. And I'm not sure if there's a specific instance they're discussing, but that's my $3 worth of thinking on it. So. Go ahead.
And if there are any other questions, please feel free to write that in to your chat box. And what I'm actually going to do is we had some audio problems in the beginning and visual problems in as well. So I was wondering if Elaine can go back to the start of your presentation, not go through it all because unfortunately we don't have time, but if you could just summarize the beginning part of your presentation.
Oh, sure. Well, I'll do my best to do it in a nutshell, and but I understand folks will get the text and
yes,
as well, hopefully. And hopefully, at least there was some recording. So the beginning of the presentation, and apologies that it didn't come through clearly, was just a little discussion of how, basically how our topic today is looking at the influence of the 50-year rule on the practice of preservation, and how this concept of time and a sort of artificial split between present and past functions, what it was intended to function for, how it's functioned, the results of sort of in the preservation landscape. And I went over a little bit about, what the 50-year guideline or rule is, why it was instituted, what it was supposed to function as, and also went a little bit into where it comes from, which is actually didn't originate with the National Register program specifically, but actually was created by the Historic Site Survey, which was a predecessor to the National Historic Landmark Program, overseen by the National Park Service, which was charged with identifying nationally significant sites that were worthy of preservation, but also for potential inclusion as federally operated units within the national park system. So a fairly high bar for what that group was looking at when they instituted sort of an age threshold. And in fact, originally the age threshold for what the Historic Site Survey would consider for designation was was from resources from before 1870. So basically in the early 20th century, they weren't looking at anything that postdated the Civil War. And it was revised in the 50s to be a 50-year window. Which is what we have today. And a lot of the Historic Site Survey criteria for their own program were actually adapted almost directly into the National Register criteria when it was established in 1966 with the National Historic Preservation Act. So there's always been this concept of needing a sort of a time threshold for a number of purposes. I think research into the origins of the 50-year rule has shown that there was a concern about controversy having subsided on sites that were more recent history. There was concern about political pressure, since the Park Service did get a lot of political pressure in the early years of the site survey to designate things that probably would not have made the cut today, certainly even after they were 50 years old or more. There's some interesting examples of that. And also they were looking at everything in American history from, from before Europeans arrived to the present, and that just, was a huge bar. So they had to have some sort of a limit to what they could consider to help frame their work. And I think, I'm not exactly sure when folks weren't able to hear me again, but in essence, we also looked at sort of the unevenness it's wrought on the landscape, how much it influences things well beyond the National Register in terms of our local planning, local protections. There's a lot of demolitions, lay ordinances around the country that apply to buildings, only to buildings that are over 50 years old, for example. Our survey is all sort of falls in line with that guideline as well. I think that's about where folks probably joined. So apologies that there's a little bit more to it than that, of course. But
Right, and I want to apologize as well. I'm sorry about both the audio and the visual, and I'm going to see what we can do for your inconvenience. And also we had another question. Are you aware of any discussion that the National Park Service level on regarding changing the 50-year rule or even emphasizing it as a guideline?
In terms of doing away with it or relaxing it, or I guess I'm not sure. I guess we could observe that I think there's varying levels of interpretation, before you get to the National Park Service of the 50-year rule sometimes. But, a lot of the times when I think there have been public discussions with the National Park Service about this criteria, about this, and it's more than a guideline. I mean, it's listed under the criterion. It's not a criterion, it's not A, B, C, D, but it is not necessarily a guideline either. But they do tend to have a fairly liberal attitude about exceptional significance, I think, when they engage in public discussions on it. And, there's, like with any policy, there are strengths and there are weaknesses to having it. And I think when you consider, for example, the fact that the resources that the Army stewards or the Department of Defense stewards in this country, the vast majority of them are greater than 50 years old, right? The great majority of them are over 50 years old right now. If we were to, take that if we were to remove the 50-year criterion, I think, there would be a lot of federal agency preservation programs that would be even more underwater than they are now. So there is this functional aspect to it as a bulwark. I think but it is, I think there has been more emphasis from the Park Service and public discussions about the flexibility of it, about the interpretation of what exceptional significance means. But I don't think that perhaps that liberalness is always universally embraced even at the Park Service or among some of the state historic preservation offices and even local preservation professionals who are part of the system that lists things to the National Register. It's very uneven around the country. There are some offices of SHPO offices that are fantastically receptive, and there are others who are notoriously unreceptive. All shall remain nameless. But that's just. I think that it would be the Park Service. I don't know of any intention for them to provide additional guidance, certainly, and Chris is shaking her head as well. Apologies, we don't think Chris's microphone is working as it should. So I'm taking visual cues from her. But certainly, I think, it would be interesting to have further discussions with them about examples and more openness about their interpretation of exceptional significance, more guidance perhaps. Detailed guidance around the country.
Okay, well, we have a couple more minutes, so you can type in questions. And while we're doing that, I just wanted to remind everybody of the upcoming California Preservation Conference, which this year is May 15th to May 18th. It's going to be in Santa Monica. So if you are considering at all coming, I'm encouraging you to register. We also have the 2011 Preservation Design Awards. We're taking applications for that up until June 15th. I don't see any more questions. We just got one in, and that is, how does the California Register deal with the 50-year exception rule?
I am not well schooled in all of the intricacies of the California Register, but my understanding, and I know we have some folks who probably on the phone today who can answer this immediately, but is that it is relative. It follows the National Register that criteria, of exceptionally significant. Something generally needs to be 50 years old unless there's an exceptional significance argument. But as you've seen from one of the examples we showed here of the La Laguna de San Gabriel playground, certainly I think that there are plenty of resources listed on the California Register, that that have shown, that have followed that same model and have been successfully listed.
Another question is, Caltrans generally asks surveyors to include resources 45 years old or older. Are there other agencies that you know of who use this strategy?
Yeah, I think that's pretty typical, actually, not just in not just among California state agencies, but nationwide. And I think it's largely a reflection of the shelf life of the study or the project, not necessarily because they're being liberal regarding the span of resources that they would, they would be taking in. And actually, at least in my time in doing cultural resource survey for departments of transportation and for transportation projects, there was there was very limited direction and no explicit scoping that you would be looking at resources that might, be less than 50 years old but exceptionally significant. It was only if you came across something that was, that was so clearly, of paramount significance, that it was that you couldn't ignore it. I think was typically what happened, which is too bad. But again, with the structure of preservation set so geared towards this one number, this one age threshold, you can see that trickle-down effect in terms of how it influences what we look at in terms of, at a very basic level, the scopes of work and what federal agencies will pay to evaluate because of their responsibilities to comply with Section 106 or with CEQA or, with Section 4F. So, it's kind of a self-perpetuating, situation.
Here is another question. It's kind of a longer question. Will you consider writing some talking points to address the question about balancing less than 50 years old preservation with economic development? Would it be handled the same stuff as greater than 50 years of age? For example, adaptive reuse, incentives, sustainability.
I think we certainly would if we understood, the needs. It's certainly these resources are under tremendous, pressure for redevelopment, tremendous pressure for demolition, because, too old to be new, too new to be old. So I think that would be an interesting thing to kind of think about more. I think in terms of preservation versus sort of more like conservation, I think is often, sort of the depending on the resource, especially if it's a resource of scale, that can be a tricky thing to think about in terms of community values, preservation values. But certainly we would consider it, and if you'd like to contact us after the webinar or, in the future and tell us a little bit more about what your interest is in that area, we can certainly talk about doing that.
And it's just right after 1 o'clock, so we are going to close. If you have any other questions, you can feel free to email me at CINGRASSIA@californiapreservation.org. I just want to thank our presenters today, Elaine Stiles and Chris Madrid French, and to also remind you that the PowerPoint presentation and the recording of the webinar will be sent to you. So thank you again for joining us, and we will talk to you soon.